Well, I'm delighted to be here at Rosebery Road Studios with Crystal D. Evans to talk about her latest exhibition, which is kind of toured in several galleries across Europe and now is here in Bath. So Crystal, tell us about the exhibition itself.
Thank you, James. So this is called What Remains, and it's a philosophical look at memory and perception and how we see really the cycle of life. And it has an overarching tonality of equanimity, a sense of acceptance, but also it questions things around identity and self and the stories that we inherit and the stories that we pass on. And it's made predominantly up of black and white photography with photographs that are taken from all over the world that speak to universal truths. And the response that I've had from people is that it feels very emotionally resonant. I've had people in tears, not because it's bad, but because it's really touched them and it talks to something that we all go through, whether that's changes, trauma, transformation. In amongst the black and white photography, there is integrated poetry. And the poetry, I've always been a poet, it's part of my practice. And what's interesting about that is that it's born of and inspired deeply by Stoicism. And I follow Marcus Aurelius's Stoicism, the idea in his Meditations, which is born of Epictetus. And it's really about trying to develop and nurture a self-compassion, a wisdom, and a balance when we look at things that befall us, that affect us, and how we are in control of how we respond. And so that philosophical poetry is gently provocative, it gently touches on some values, it makes us think about how we see our own lives and what we've been through. And then you also have, in amongst this big body of work at Rosebery Road Studios here, some sculpture. And the sculpture is stoneware, which is clay sculpture, so you'll have some figurative work, you'll have more abstract work, and it's all made of this stoneware clay, which is unglazed, so it has a very raw feel, and you can see in a way the interaction between how it was made. It feels very process-led, so you can see the imprints of my hands on that work, but at the same time, if you look very closely, there are fragments, and it's not perfect, it's intentionally frayed and fragmented, so it helps you sit with that. So what I'm trying to do, James, is trying to create a bit of a space for quiet reflection, if you like, so that it asks you what memories and associations do you bring to the table when I talk about these topics. And so far it's been very successful. As you mentioned, it's shown all over Europe so far. Yeah. It's been during the Venice Biennale, it's been at the Rome Contemporary, the Barcelona Contemporary, and here in its fullest guise we have at the Rosebery Road Studios, which I'm delighted because it's such a beautiful space.
Yeah, it's a genuinely beautiful, reflective and immersive collection that you've put together here. And you talk about Stoicism as part of the inspiration behind that. And
yes.
Within my understanding of Stoicism, acceptance of death is something that's quite important to living the good life, living as fully as you can. Is that touched upon in the work? And if so, how does that reveal itself?
Yes, absolutely. So the work has a supporting book, and the reason I mention that is because the organisation and the curation of this show reflects that book. So it has chapters. So there are chapters on love and growth, on work and play, on strength and wisdom, and death and legacy. And in fact, the wall behind us is the death and legacy wall. But this idea of being steady and considering how, I think Marcus Aurelius said it best, and I'm going to really poorly misquote this, it's from one of his meditations, but it's to do with all the trials and tribulations and trauma that we experience in life, and that includes our own death and the death of our loved ones. He says it's a little bit like an ink dot on the page, and you can choose to draw a circle in ink around that ink dot and continuously draw a circle around it to draw focus onto that. Or in so doing, you realise that you're making that ink dot bigger and it becomes the pain that is the central to your life. And you have control over whether you increase that and exacerbate that pain, or you respond to it in a way that actually is much more self-soothing, much more compassionate and much more generous to others. And that's to do it with a sense of equanimity and acceptance of it's just a natural course in life as death is coming to all of us. And so it has given me my own solitude, my own sanctuary, when I face very difficult times. And I know it's definitely helped many other practitioners, from cognitive behavioural therapists all the way through to art therapists to patients and people who've gone through strife and death.
You talk about facing difficult times. And to ask you a personal question, as I understand it, you once encountered a profound injury that kind of meant you had that lived experience of losing some of what made you at the time. Through that, would you be willing to talk a little bit about that and how that's influenced your practice as well?
Yeah, I'm happy to. So when I was 30, I was having a very busy life as a board director at a insight research company, and it meant that I was travelling all over the world, which was a wonderful privilege. And I did a lot of ethnography, and I worked with companies like the World Health Organization and did some really, really wonderful, interesting work. And so quite unexpectedly, I was in Turkey when I had a major spinal injury, and it meant that I was left pretty bereft, actually, and completely ill-equipped mentally and physically for a complete change in my life. I had various surgeries. I was unable to leave my house for a year. I had 24-hour care. I had lockdown before COVID happened, and I wasn't equipped mentally, and so I did have a lot of therapy. And that was when I came upon Stoicism. And it was introduced to me by this wonderful friend of mine, who's written a book, by the way, called Positive Psychology. His name's Tim LeBon. And that was a really wonderful thing. And also I read a book that you guys might know, which is The Body Holds the Score, which is a very famous book, also very powerful. And all of these things were sort of the beginning, if you like, leaf drops that landed on my new ground that I didn't recognise. And I had to choose to lean in or not. And I was scared and I was alone and it felt very, very frightening. But slowly and surely, I took the right steps to get better in myself. And there's not many things that you can do when all of these, like the sword of Damocles is hanging above your head, and it feels very there's lots of hyperbole attached to not knowing your future and what things might befall you, and you feel completely lost like a child. And so it takes a lot of resilience, resolute kind of determinism, should we say, to make the steps to try and move forwards. And during that time of healing, and I obviously I still have chronic pain, and it's a degenerative spinal condition, so I still have that disability. But what's interesting is that during that period of sort of psychological change, I was able to realise that I'm in control of a lot more. The world wasn't just a world of no's, and it wasn't just a world of calamity and sadness and catastrophe and all of those things. There was more to it than that, and I began to see in colour again. And I think that it takes time and it takes a lot of patience from people around you, but also for yourself, because I think we can become very hard on ourselves. We feel like we're not, we're failing in some way, or we feel we hold on to that calamity, that sadness, and it can feel like a trauma that we choose to continue like baggage. Now, the way I've processed my baggage is that I have found that I've made some wiser choices about what I do in my life. I've tried to get the balance right, and so that meant ensuring that I was doing activities that wouldn't burn me out, that I was managing my energy better. I was asking for help, which I was really bad at doing before, and I was finding solace in things that I'd almost kind of forgotten about before. And by doing these small activities, and in many ways it was art and reading and learning, for me that was my thing, and music, and also doing a lot of connection with others. So, connecting in your community and connecting with networks and finding people again. It really helped pull me out of that space. And you can see that philosophy has just grown and built. And in my artwork today, it's a really important tone of voice. It's a really important part of my way of seeing the world. And it has enabled me to move through and navigate things. And I've been through, many more sad things that have happened to me that have, as is the case with all of us, we all go through lots of different changes, highs and lows.
It's life. It keeps happening to us, doesn't it?
It keeps happening. And I think the more you feel equipped, the more you can anticipate curveballs and know that you'll get through it again because you've been through it before, that it won't be as bad and you're made of stronger stuff than you realise. And that's very reassuring.
Well, and what an amazing legacy to have come out of that time, flowing through your practice. And one of the things that really strikes me about you is your absolute determination that practice should translate into the real world, drive change. So, presenting your work at COP29,
yes.
As part of climate summits and really bringing the work to the places where decisions are being made and where it can influence. Why is that so important to you? Is that part of that same philosophy? How does that work for you?
That's a really good question, James, because I feel a sense of urgency, even though I'm creating space and quiet, and I hope a sense of sanctuary where people can reflect and bring their own, agendas to the table. I think it's really important that the art should have some level of activism. Otherwise it feels meaningless. Otherwise it's just decorative. And that's okay too. People need pretty things in their homes. I've got pretty things in my home. But I think that powerful art, and art that I want to try and aspire to achieve, can create ripples and it can create culture. And if you can create a culture that brings people together, that gets them to pause and reflect on how they see the world, how they see themselves, how they see others, and recognise that there's still a lot of oppression, there's still a lot of binary opposites, there's still a lot of visual, verbal noise that's very confrontational and scary. And actually, if we get people to pause and reflect that actually we all carry this prejudice, we all have this bias, we all have this weight and baggage, then perhaps the world will be slightly kinder and a bit more thoughtful. And I think powerful art can do that sort of thing. It really can.
So kind of stopping time and allowing space for reflection that can allow compassion. What an incredible goal to set. And I think that chimes with so much of the activism that you see today is trying to confront, if that's the right word, some of those trends towards ever greater kind of polarization and division.
Exactly.
And you mentioned earlier finding commonality and themes through your work, and you've talked about how your practice is in part inspired or informed by your own kind of mixed cultural background. Can you talk to us a little bit about how you view that sort of cultural difference and commonality and how that informs your practice as well?
Yeah, of course. So in answer to the question, which is often implied, which is, please explain your face. My heritage is, my mum is Malaysian Chinese, my dad is South African Ugandan, and there's also Welsh in there, and also genealogy has proven I'm a descendant of one of Shakespeare's players, so chuck that in for the mix.
Yeah. So
there's a melting pot of cultures. I'm British born, but of course both parents are migrants, and so this is kind of what colonialism looks like. But what's I think more to the point is that when I was doing 20 plus years of cultural ethnography, and that's where you go into people's homes where they live all over the world, from really unusual places, not your normal TripAdvisor locations, to places like the Ivory Coast or Algeria or Iran, Iraq, Oman. I've been to lots of really unusual places and lived with people for some months to understand their behaviours and their drives and their ambitions and their interests and their tensions. And when you examine life like that, you start realising, when you get to your 2000th interview with people, their focus groups, what have you, you start realising actually we are, as humans, kind. We are naturalistically kind. We're kind to strangers. We have hospitality. There is a generosity within all of us. You have to learn cruelty. You have to experience suffering to replicate it. And so the fact that we are all, as humans, inherently kind is a very reassuring position to recognise. And you start seeing it no matter what nation or race or creed or colour or background you are faced by. And so these photographs in this collection are from all over the world, and they may be unusual to our Western eye. You may see, for example, in Devotion, a picture of a woman carrying very tropical-looking fish back from a fish market on clearly a tropical island, and it may look so far removed with its corrugated fences and so on from our experience here in the UK. But actually the words will talk to every mother's experience of what it's like to be devoted to her children, to her loved ones, to feel that sense of duty, and how she walks the path her mother walked. And similarly, there's a sense of solitude when you look at what I took 20 years ago to mean a very desolate, lonely image of a small child, a child in Fukuyama, Japan. And I was honestly, when I took the photograph 20 years ago, I thought, gosh, where are his parents? I was so emotionally invested and I was concerned for his welfare. Well, 20 years later, I realised I have a bit more of a mature appreciation for what that picture is. And actually, it's about solitude and it's about self-compassion and calm. And I look at it and think, actually, that is the very picture of solitude. And that's okay. And it's not necessarily, the picture hasn't changed. That's the important thing. But our perception as we get older and as we begin to experience the world and start to realise things about where we sit in reference to the rest of the world and what our position is, sometimes you can realise that your perception changes over time. Your values might change. Even if the world is pushing you to be one way or another or believe in one thing or another, sometimes it's good to just step back and recognise, well, where have I come from and where do I want to go and what do I feel? So I'm very interested in people's bias, actually. I'm very interested in people's experiences and stories. And I don't think that work like this ends at gallery wall. I feel like it's the conversations that start things off.
Yeah, and I guess the lived experience of each of the subjects really counts. That one person's tranquility could be another person's loneliness, and vice versa.
Yes.
Really, it depends where you are and how you're encountering that situation.
That's right.
On the wall behind us, we've got the works that connect to grief and legacy, that obviously speak to different cultural contexts. In your travels and in capturing those images, is there any commonality that you've witnessed in those experiences that you feel you could share?
Yes, I think what's very interesting about grief in lots of different cultures is that we have a sense of obligation, duty, often solemnity, in most cultures it's solemnity, which is attached to someone dying, someone passing on. And the language and the rituals associated with that can be very focused on celebrating the life of the person that's passed. But actually what sometimes gets overlooked, I've noticed, whether you're in, some of these are in Seychelles, some of these are in, all over the place really. We've got Mexico and Brazil behind me and so on. I think what's interesting is that often in that social recognition, that sphere of influence to the person that's passed on, there's not necessarily a recognition that it's the individual's grief and that they have their own pace and that my grief is not going to be the same as your grief, even though we share this love of the same person. And so we are left bereft and we go through these rites and practices, whether it's, celebratory and a big wake or drinking an island, whatever the big thing is that we might do to celebrate that person's life, or in all solemnity, follow the rituals that preserve that legacy. But also I think it's very difficult and tensions can arise often, particularly within close families, whereby a sibling's grief doesn't match the same pace or the same flavour, if you like, as the other. And that can be very jarring, and that's a very difficult and lonely experience. And I think, for example, in the work that you guys do, you recognise that. You recognise the individualism in grief and in anticipating grief. And I think that's a very powerful and important thing to do. There's a sculpture here, which is called The Anticipation of Grief. It's a clay sculpture, and there's a head that's sort of sinking on a sloped plane. And underneath that sloped plane, there are these sort of crumbling pillars, if you like, that hold it up. And the reason I had this image in my mind, and it's clearly very semiotic, it's clearly very metaphorical, is because I've been in a position of care. And I feel like when you're a carer for someone who is on that journey, sometimes you lose your own individuality.
Yeah.
Because you're so focused on their care, you're so giving in anticipation, and you can't feel bereavement yet. And you're preparing, but you can't quite prepare. And so there's a lot of tension. And in a way, it's a weirdly thankless task.
Absolutely.
Because often that person who is so ill doesn't necessarily recognise the sacrifices too. So the piece, yes, it's in recognition of that journey we all go on, but it's absolutely specifically in recognition and a salute, if you like, to carers. Because sometimes we feel in our individual experience, in anticipation of grief, that we may not be that well seen. And I think, your hospice, Dorothy House, is doing an amazing thing. actually seeing and making space for those carers. And I think that's really, really important.
Yeah, I mean, it's that journey that a carer goes on can be so isolating in of itself.
Yes.
That in caring, quite often those responsibilities mean you give up the things that make you yourself, and what you put in that space is the care that you're giving to that individual.
Yes.
And then when that individual dies, not only have you lost the passions and the interests that perhaps you had before that you gave up for them, you've then lost that person as well. And so that process of reconstructing yourself after that loss can be twice as hard perhaps as it might be for those who haven't had to take up that duty of care.
Absolutely.
But then there's also something that can be empowering and fulfilling about being alongside someone through that journey. And so it's a really difficult balance. And I think everyone who goes through that, their path is different. But I don't think it's ever easy for anyone. It's never
That's right.
the joy of caring for someone in their last years. It's it has moments of joy, but there's real sacrifice and kind of loss within that as well, which is a huge part of it. I mean, it's interesting you talk about anticipatory grief, because we will talk about people potentially dying 3 times. So first you die socially when you lose the things that make you yourself, then you die physically, and then there are cultures around the world who would say you truly die the last time someone speaks your name.
Yes.
And so there's that sense that you live on all the time, you're living in memory.
Yes.
But I think there's a mirroring of that in those around you, those that love you and care for you, that your grief begins as you start not having the same relationship, not knowing the same person that you have known. And those of us who have older parents who certainly encountered that, I think there are lots of fields where that gets replicated increasingly with people with dementia, especially, that the person that you love might not be the person who's in front of you, even though they're breathing and talking. And I think, carers go on that journey, really, that their grief starts in coming to acceptance that the person is going to die, not at the moment where you might start arranging a funeral, though, in the right context, that can be a powerful thing. And so that's clearly something that you've encountered as well.
Yes.
Have you found expressing that in your art to be powerful in terms of your own journey of processing those experiences?
Yes, very much so. Some people turn to art for meaning making and for catharsis. And it has that role to play, for sure. And there have been moments in my own making whereby even just by going over recordings, permissed recordings, of people that I love who have had dementia, and over years, and I've listened to hours and hours upon hours of them just talking at me in conversation, and then I've used that, like those soundscapes, and often those people are not necessarily always happy. It can quickly switch, as you might know, into them being very haunted by something that's quite traumatic for them from their past, and you have to sort of carefully, agilely get them back on track and calm them down. So there have been those sort of interactions where suddenly they can seem quite haunted by something, like those repeated phrases. And I've used that in my artwork making. So, for example, there's a piece coming up for my next body of work, and it's called Fault Lines.
Okay.
And that involves, because I'm interested in narrative, that involves thousands of red threads that represent the stories and beliefs that we hold. And they are wrapped around a clay sculpture of a baby in the fetal position. They're all tied, all these red threads, thousands of them. And in amongst the threads are photographs that were printed on cotton from my own family, past lineage. So photographs not only that I took, but from before I was born. And they're all of memories from a particular member of the family. And that person has said certain things in their illness about these characters. And so what I've done, after listening to 200, 300 plus hours of these recordings, is I've taken those phrases and I've sewn them in red thread into these photographs, so that when you walk into the space, at first you just see all of this sort of visual noise, which is quite what it's like in life, complicated and messy. But the more you look, the more you realise that we have a choice. We can either inherit these narratives and pass them on, and sometimes they're quite toxic, or you can choose to cast off with a knot, and that's what the poem's about, that goes along with it, fault lines. And I think it's really interesting you talk about the 3 moments of death, because there's a piece just behind you there, James, and it's called Here Lies. And I took that at an ossuary, which is a wonderful word, ossuary, that was in Kent. And they've got all of these bones of the dead from the medieval period. And what's interesting about that is it made me contemplate one particular, you can see the skeleton there. And I just thought, well, actually, what's really interesting is I don't know this person. This was a person who lived during this time, totally unrelated to me, had an entirely different life. And here I am looking at these relics, and I'm having a feeling, and I'm having an experience of these bones. This was somebody, and I try to imagine their life, and I try to imagine what they would eat and do and say, and whether they were a good person. And so the poem reflects that legacy. So I sometimes think about not just how we might grieve someone's passing, how we might sustain their legacy, but also what do you carry in yourself to make sure that your own legacy is a positive one? What do you want people to say about your life? How do you want to live meaningfully to make the most of the time we have? And I think, in a way, the best gift of all from people that leave us is a choice. And we have a choice to engage with our life, engage with people, continue to create intersections in our brain. You know, the physiology of our brain after this interaction, James, will be different physically because of our interaction. And I think that's a wonderful thing. We are anatomically made up of all the interactions that we have with people. And so it's really easy to just sort of decrease and go back into the snail shell after someone who you love and you've been dedicated to for a long time passes away. But then actually it's so much healthier for us. It's human nature for us to reach out and find ourselves again and think about our own legacy. And I've been thinking about that a lot in this work.
Yeah, absolutely. That appreciation of life, which is very much the mirror of death. It feels like such an important theme through your practice, and it certainly
yes.
It is for those who deliver end-of-life care as well. So hopefully people will come to this exhibition, either here at the studios or when it's, I assume, going to be continue its tour.
That's true. It continues in Kent, in Folkestone, at a lovely gallery called Strange Cargo, and that will be in March.
Fantastic, and there's a book available as well.
Yes.
If there was one thing you'd want people to take away from it, or a reason to come and see the exhibition, what would that be?
Thank you for asking. I think it would be, sometimes in life we're not given opportunities to just pause and reflect. Sometimes we wait for the cup of tea with a neighbour and it all comes blurting out. Or we end up having very deep WhatsApp messages with our friends and suddenly it goes off track and you want to say stuff about your own truths and how you feel about something, but you feel somehow constrained, not able to, or time prevents you. I want people to be able to engage, and art like this allows you to take that time to self-soothe, to reflect, to see what agendas and biases and prejudices and narratives you carry, and hopefully that will give you just an ounce, just a moment of calm and solitude, space to think clearly just for a moment, which is a gift, I think. It's hard to come across that these days, so that's why I think this is important work.
Well, thank you. It's a wonderful exhibition, and thank you for your time, Crystal D. Evans. We
Oh,
hugely appreciate it.
Thank you.